Hey everybody, welcome back to another tutorial. In this one we are going to be working on a beautiful watercolour painting. This is going to be a monochrome painting of this beautiful woodland scenery with a couple of animal silhouettes in the foreground as well of a nice deer and a boar. So here you can see the final painting that we are going to be working on. And you can see that this painting actually has a lot of depth that we are going to create through using a varied amount of values in our painting. As you can see, the trees in the background are really nice and light, and then we got some darker trees in the foreground. And I'm going to be teaching you how you can create this illusion of depth and distance in your painting. So the materials that I'll be using for this painting are firstly my cold pressed watercolour paper. I will be using two colours that I'll be mixing to make one colour, which I'll go through in a minute. Also my silver black velvet paintbrushes, a jar of water, a palette to mix your paints, a sponge to create the foliage texture, some tissue to blot off your brushes, and also some tape to tape down the borders of your paper. You'll need a pencil to do your initial sketch outline and a kneaded eraser to lighten it up before you start painting. So the two colours that I'll be using are Prussian blue and Paynes grey, and I'm using the Holbein watercolours. You can use any watercolours that you have, and you don't even have to use this colour. The important thing is that you're only using one colour. Now I'm actually going to mix these two colours together to form the one colour that I'll be using. Because the Prussian blue was a bit too vibrant, a bit too much of a bright blue, and the Paynes grey would be a bit too grey and a bit too dull, so I'm mixing them together to create a nice balance. And you can see that I'm just mixing together the really thick paint. It doesn't matter if you don't have tube paints, you can use a pan set, it really doesn't matter. And you can see that when you add more and more water, you're able to get a varied amount of values and different colours, even though we're just using one colour. By adding more water, you're able to control how light or dark the paint is. I will leave all of the materials listed in the description so that you can get everything ready before you start. As always, not only is the materials list in the description of this post, but also you can get access to the reference image and sketch outline that you'll need to complete this tutorial as well. Once again, they are both attached to this post for you. Here you can see the reference I'll be following, and here is the sketch outline that I created for this tutorial. So let's get started. As you can see on my palette is those two colours that I've mixed together just in their really concentrated form. I haven't mixed in any water yet. So that's what I recommend doing. Create a really concentrated version of your paint at the top of your palette. Now the first thing that I'm doing is I'm just going in with that kneaded eraser and making sure my sketch outline is nice and light. And the reason why I like to do this before I go in with my paints is because I don't want any of the graphite lines to show through when I start adding watercolour, as this will really ruin the illusion that I'm trying to go for of having really soft trees in the background and look really faded out and light. It will be slightly ruined if you can see the grey outlines showing through. So let's get into part one of this tutorial, which is the background. And the first thing that I'm going to do is take some clean water on my large paintbrush. You can use any large round paintbrush that you have, or even a flat brush, it really doesn't matter. And I'm taking that clean water and I'm just completely wetting the whole surface of the paper, making sure to get into all of the corners and the edges as well. Make sure that you don't miss out any little areas. If I'm unsure where I've added the water, sometimes I tilt my head to the side and look to see which parts of the paper are glistening and are therefore wet and which parts still look dry. And I just keep going over the surface multiple times. You want to make sure that the paper is nice and wet throughout, but you don't want puddles of water to form on the paper. If you do notice that your paper starts to dry quite quickly, then what I like to do sometimes is wet the paper, wait 30 seconds so that the paper can absorb what it's going to absorb, and then re-wet it again before I start. So I've took a bit of the paint from the top and mixed in a little bit of water, and I'm going to start to work on the background. So I'm not working on any trees yet, just the background, so the sky and the mist. And you can see that I'm taking that colour and I'm focusing on adding it around the corners and edges of the painting. So the edges and corners are going to be the darkest, and then it's going to get lighter towards the middle. So think of it as a big circle, and in the middle of the circle here is where it's lightest. I'm starting off very light with this paint, and then you can add more of the blue if you need to the corners and sides to make it a bit darker. The reason why we wet the paper first is because we are using the wet on wet technique. And the great thing about using this technique is that it prevents you getting any harsh edges in your painting. So if you want a soft out of focus look like I want for this background, then it's great to go in and wet the paper first before adding in the paint, because the paint will nicely soften out and bleed into that water that we've added to the surface of the paper, and will give us a really smooth look. So you can see that I'm just adding a bit more paint, not only to the edges and corners, but also to the bottom of the painting, near the ground, just behind the animals. And you'll want to work fairly quickly when doing this, so that the paper doesn't dry before you've completed this layer. And once again, I'm just building up these layers by taking more and more paint until I've got it dark enough. It's better to add too little and have to go in again than to add too much and have to try and remove it. And you can see I'm taking my brush and I'm swiping it upward to follow the pattern of the trees to create that streaky look. Taking a little bit more paint, just darkening up the bottom, once again doing that swiping motion. And my paper is starting to dry a bit, so I don't want to spend too much longer on this. And doing this swiping motion is a great way to naturally integrate these darker paint strokes with the rest of the lighter areas. So I just brush it upwards to nicely integrate it and gradient into that lighter sky above it. And this can help create the illusion of really faint trees right in the distance that you can barely see. So I'm doing that for the whole bottom half of the painting. And this just gives us a really nice base to work on top of and to add all of the trees to. And don't worry too much about covering all of the ground, because as you can see in the reference, the ground is really, really dark, and we will be painting that in later on. So don't worry about getting the ground as dark as it needs to be. That's not the point here. We're just focusing on doing the sky behind it. But as you can see, I've started to overlap paint into the ground because we don't need to try and keep it white, because it's going to be the darkest anyway, so we will cover all of this up with the really dark paint. So it's easier just to cover the ground as well. But really we're just focusing on getting the sky how we want it to be. Just adding a few little adjustments, and you can see that I'm still using that large paintbrush. It's important that you use a brush size that is appropriate for the area that you're doing. So because I want to cover the whole of the background and I'm using the wet in wet technique, which means I have to work fairly quickly, it's most efficient to do this area with a larger paintbrush so that I can cover a larger area more quickly. So now that we've finished painting the background, I'm going to dry it using a hairdryer. And it looks like I'm holding this hairdryer really close, but I'm not actually holding it that close at all. I'm keeping it about 12 inches away from the paper, and I like to use it on a cooler setting, and this just helps speed up the drying time. But I don't use a hairdryer if the paper's really wet because it can push the paints around, but for this it's a really good little trick to quickly dry the paper so that you can get on to working on the next layer. And for this next part, we're going to start to paint in the distant trees. So in the bottom bit of your palette, just below where you've added that really concentrated paint, I'm just mixing up a really diluted version of this colour, which means that I've got to add lots of water to that bit of paint. So just take a tiny bit of your concentrated paint and add a lot of water. And when you're painting the trees, to create the look of distance and the illusion of depth in your painting, you need to add a variety of values to your trees. So the trees furthest in the distance are going to appear the lightest. As you can see in the reference, the faraway trees are really light and faint, and the trees closer to us in the foreground of the reference you can see are really dark. So I'm starting off by working on the trees furthest in the background, and like I just said, the trees furthest in the background will appear the lightest. So that's how we're going to be building up our layers with this painting. We're going to work from light to dark, which means for these first trees you need to mix in the most water into your paint, as we want these trees to be really faint. And I'm just simply going in and I'm using the reference to help guide me as to where the most trees are. And I'm just painting in some beautiful thin trees in the distance. And I try to add a bit of curve to them and not do them too uniformed. I do the trunk thickest at the bottom, and then it slowly tapers off to be thinner as we go upwards and as it branches off into more parts. Also, if you look at the reference, one thing that you'll notice is that the trees furthest in the distance appear thinner. So their size is smaller, they appear smaller, and therefore thinner, whereas the trees closest to us are a lot thicker. So bear this in mind when you paint your trees. You want these ones in the distance to be nice and thin. You can see that I'm waving my hand a little bit to get some jagged lines. And if you add your trees and you feel like they're too dark, you can go in with a tissue like I'm doing here and just tap off some of the colour to lighten it up a bit. But to do this trick, you must do it whilst the paint is still wet, so you'll have to act quickly if you want to do that. You can also see that I've switched to a much smaller brush for this. That is so that I can get in all of these tiny details. So I do recommend that you have a variety of paintbrushes at your disposal, because you will get the best luck with your painting by using the most appropriate sized brushes. And the great thing about this reference is that you don't have to follow it exactly. You can be creative and change up where you want to add the trees, especially in the background where we haven't sketched them all out. We've sketched out some of the main trees more in the foreground, but for the background trees, you can be a bit creative with it and just go ahead and start painting in trees where you want. But make sure you're following the general look of the reference. So for example, all of the trees are pretty straight upright. So I'm doing a lot of my trees quite straight. They're not curving or bending to an angle. Some I'm doing thinner, and then some I'll do slightly thicker as they're more closer to us. And this should be a really therapeutic experience. You don't need to rush it, you don't need to panic with it. You can just really take your time and enjoy the process with this one. There's no rush because we're not using the wet and wet technique anymore. The paper is nice and dry, so we're just going in and painting in the trees where we want. That's why it's important that you use the hairdryer to dry the background first, because if you don't dry the background first, then when you paint in these trees, they'll bleed out into the background and they won't stay very crisp and detailed. As you can see, at this stage, these trees are barely visible. I'm using such a light wash of paint that you can hardly even see these trees. But that's fine because we're working in layers and you don't really want to see these trees too much because they're just meant to be subtle in the distance. We're going to have plenty of darker trees taking up all of our attention and pulling our eyes to them and being big focal points. So we just want these background ones to be really subtle. And it's these subtleties that will actually make your painting look so much better. You don't want everything to be super bold because then that will ruin the illusion. You need to have these subtle trees in the background where you're thinking to yourself, is that a tree in the background? Because when you're looking at the reference, there are such faint trees that you're really having to look to see if they even are a tree. So it's good that you create some really light trees in your painting. Once again, once you've done that layer, you can take your hairdryer and just go over it. And it shouldn't take too long to dry it, just a minute or two, especially with this layer because we're using the wet on dry rather than the wet on wet. So there's not many areas to dry here. And as you can see, we've got a really nice dry layer to build on top of. So instead of mixing up a whole new wash, all I did is I took a bit more of that paint and added it to our previous wash to make it a bit darker. And I'm going to repeat the exact same technique and process, but this time I'm painting slightly darker trees. And these trees are ones that are slightly more towards the foreground, so they are slightly closer to us. And that is why they are darker. But also, this means that they'll be slightly thicker as well, because they're closer to us. And at this stage, I am looking at the reference a bit more now that I'm doing some of the darker trees and some of these thicker trees in the foreground. I want to pay closer attention to the reference to make sure that I'm on the right track. But if you're feeling more confident, then let your creativity run free and just go with the flow a bit and do what you want. Once again, you can use the tissue if you want to lighten up any areas. And so I'm just going to repeat the same process. I'm working from the left-hand side over to the right-hand side. And once again, you can see that my branches, my tree trunks are thicker at the bottom and then get thinner at the top. And I particularly like to use that tissue technique towards the top of the trees because right at the top is where the most sort of light is coming through, the most sort of sunlight peeping through the trees. So naturally they make the top of the trunks look a little bit lighter. And once again, you want to leave yourself a lot of room to go darker. So don't add too much paint to the wash. You still want it to be a fairly light wash because we have got really dark trees to go in the foreground. So you may feel the itch to go darker and think, oh, this is still quite light. But try not to go too dark because we have got to add some really dark trees later on. And if everything is too dark, then it will ruin the illusion of distance and depth in our painting. As you can see, I'm painting over that animal silhouette rather than stopping the line and then carrying it on after that animal. I just went straight through it, and that's so that I could have more of a consistent line. And because it is a silhouette for the animal, we are going to be painting it really dark, so it doesn't matter if we add paint over the deer. And you can see that now for some of these bigger trees, I'm actually starting to branch off from the tree trunk towards the ends of the tree, where it separates a bit more. So look at the reference to see if each tree, if it separates into multiple parts, how does it branch off? And I tried to make every tree look slightly unique. You don't want your trees to all look exactly the same and super uniformed. So one common mistake that I see beginners make is that they'll do their trees all dead straight, the same thickness, not curving at all, just exactly the same, and they'll try to do them all the same. But this actually ruins the realistic look of the painting, because in reality, trees aren't the same. They're all individual. They're all slightly different thicknesses. They all curve and have bumps in slightly different areas, and some branch off more than others. Some don't really branch off at all in this reference. So try to make each tree look nice and individual, as this will not only make your painting look a lot more interesting to look at, but it will also make it more realistic. Because when you do the trees exactly the same, then it looks too uniformed and it doesn't look realistic, because trees in real life aren't exactly the same. I'm starting to paint in some of these slightly darker trees in the foreground, while getting towards the foreground, not the darkest trees, but the sort of second layer of trees from the front. Once again, you can take your time with this step, no need to rush it. I'm just going to continue to work this way, all the way over to the right hand side of this painting. One thing that you will see me doing is that whilst the tree is still wet, whilst that base wash is still wet, you can see that I'm going in with some slightly darker paint, and I'm just working that through the bottom half of the tree, which is slightly darker than the top, to create a nice gradient effect from dark at the bottom to light at the top of that tree trunk. And so this is easy to do if you add the base wash to the tree. So you mark in where the tree is with that really light wash of colour, and then you pick up a bit more paint on the tip of your brush and work that through the bottom half of the tree trunk whilst it's still wet. That'll give you a really nice effect. Also, to create a lighter look at the top, you can slightly ease the pressure off your brush so less of the paint is hitting the paper. As you can see, I'm still adding some really light trees into the background. So I'm sort of working with two steps at the moment. I'm doing really light trees more in the distance, as well as that sort of second layer of trees from the front, those slightly darker trees. So some trees that I'm painting in, like this one, I'm just sort of adding in myself, making them up, because there's really no need to follow the reference exactly. We're not necessarily trying to do an exact copy of the reference image. We're using the reference for inspiration and as a guidance tool, but that doesn't mean you can never stray away from the reference, or that the aim is to make an exact replica of the reference. You can follow it as closely or as loosely as you like. Now I'm going back through some of the previous trees that I've marked in, and once again just darkening up the bottoms of those trees. In the reference you can see that the bottom of the trees are a lot darker than the tops, so I want to match this in my painting, because this will add more depth, because it will make it look like the sun is shining through the tops of the trees. Mix in some more paint into that wash of colour. And I'm going to work on this dark tree around the boar. Pretty sure it's a boar anyway, might be wrong. And like I said, you can do this type of painting, these monochrome paintings, with any colour that you want. I think a purple would look great for this painting as well. Like a nice violet colour would look great. Or even a nice brown tone, which was actually what the original reference was. It was originally like a browny colour, but I edited it to be more blue. And so now I want to darken up the sky behind the trees on the bottom half of the painting, just above the ground. So I'm taking some paint, a very light wash on my brush, and I'm just working it in between the bottom of the trees. And this helps to blend and integrate the trees into their background and their surroundings as well. And I just felt that the background at the bottom was a bit too light. So you can go in and tweak the background if you want to, if you need to. Adding a couple more little details. But I'm not adding any detail to these far away trees yet. So as you can see in the reference, there's a lot of bits of foliage on the branches of some of these trees. And you can see that we can see the foliage for some of the more distant trees, as it's very light. But at the moment, I'm just focusing on painting in the tree trunks and the main branches. And then I will use the sponge later on to get in some of that foliage texture on the branches to make it look more interesting and detailed. Once again, I'm taking the hairdryer and I'm just drying this layer. Another thing that's important to know is that the objects furthest in the background are going to appear with less detail than the elements in the foreground. So the trees really close to us, we can see a lot of detail. We can see all of their branches, a lot of the foliage. But as we get into more of the distant trees, we can see a lot less detail. Even the trunks themselves are slightly more blurry than the tree trunks in the foreground, which are really crisp, and we can see the edges of them really well. So that's another rule to keep in your mind, that the elements furthest in the distance will appear with less detail and clarity, and the objects closest to us will therefore be more detailed. So now that that's dry, let's work on the third part of this tutorial series, which is painting in the trees in the very front. So the trees in the foreground. And because these are quite dark, you are going to want to mix a very concentrated version of this colour. So you want to take some of that concentrated paint from the top of the palette and just mix in a tiny bit of water. Just enough water to be able to get the paint to flow easily and nicely on the paper surface. If you don't add in any water at all, then it will just be too thick and impossible to paint with. It will be too gloopy. Just adding a bit more of the Paynes grey to the mixture. And I'm adding a bit more water. And as you can see, I'm still using a fairly small brush, even though these tree trunks in the foreground are thicker. The smaller brush helps us to have more control, especially because we're going to be painting a lot of thin branches. So firstly, you can see that I am going to start off by going over some of the bottoms of the trees that we have already done. Because if you look at the reference, some of these trees have really dark bottoms of the tree trunks. But I'm using the tissue to create a gradient from the bottoms of these tree trunks into the tops. And you can also use water on your brush to help blend that out as well. Like I said, I'm just going to go through some of these trees that I've already done, the ones more in the foreground, and just repeat this process until I'm happy that the values for these trees are accurate to the reference image. I especially want to darken up this thick branch that we've done, especially around where the deer is, because it's quite dark. There's not too much of a value difference between the deer and this tree. It's only slightly lighter, so I want to match that in my painting. I definitely want to darken up the portion of the tree trunk that is below the deer. I'm even darkening up the top of this tree, because I realise that it does need to go a bit darker. And so I'm just going to continue this process for a couple more minutes, just darkening up some of these trees that we've previously painted in. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. Now I'm going to start painting the first of our darkest trees. And so again, I'm starting on the left hand side, and if you look at the reference, you can see that we've got this really dark skinny tree in the front. And these trees should be very easy to mark in, because you should already have them sketched out from when you did your initial sketch outline. So with your sketch, you may not have had some of the more distant trees sketched out, which would have made it more difficult, but with these ones right in the front, it's best to have them sketched out, especially the thickest tree trunks. You may not have all of the branches sketched out, but the actual shape of the tree trunk I've got sketched out when I did my initial sketch outline. Making this tree look quite jagged and adding lots of curves gives it more of an elegant look to it, and also makes it a little more haunted looking and mystical, I think. So that's why I like adding lots of little sort of jaggedness to my trees and curves and bumps. And I like painting them quite skinny. I like these skinny trees. I do think they look quite mystical. Once again, I'm just darkening up the bottom. But you can see that already this tree is a lot darker than all of the other trees. Though we can still go darker if we need to, I like to just sort of mark it in first, paint in the shape of the tree, and then go darker. Now I'm going over to the next tree in the foreground. And I'm just repeating the same process. There's not really much to say about this part because we have already got the tree marked out. I'm just sort of filling in this area. Making sure to be really careful and make sure that I have complete control over my paintbrush so that I'm painting within the lines and getting a nice accurate shape to the tree. I'm going to add more paint to the bottom of the tree because this is the darkest point of even these closest trees. And if you're finding that your paint is sort of catching on the top of the paper and creating a really textured, dry look, then it may be because that you haven't added enough water to the paint to get it to flow freely and loosely onto the paper. You can start to see that now that we're getting in these darkish trees, the illusion of that distance and that depth is starting to form with those lighter trees in the distance. We're starting to get that distance now. And so if you had done all of these trees exactly the same value, it would have looked really flat and nowhere near as eye-catching. Whereas before you may have thought that the trees in the distance were too light to make any sort of impact. Now you can see that because they are light, they are able to make the most impact. Just darkening up this tree at the bottom. Using some water to blend that shadow upwards to create that gradient look. And you can use the tissue to blot any unwanted shadows and lighten it up a bit more. So we've got a really dark tree right next to this one, just to the right hand side of it that we've got to paint in. Once again, this is a tree that we've already got sketched out, so it's just a matter of filling in between those lines. You see that I'm using really dark, concentrated paint for this step. And so I'm just going to continue to fill in this tree. And I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. Now that I've completed that tree, I can see that this other one is a bit too light in comparison. So I'm going back in with another layer and just darkening up this tree, particularly around the bottom. It seems to be an okay value at the top, but the bottom part of this tree definitely needs to be darkened up. As this is the darkest part of the painting, it needs to pretty much be black in the darkest areas of the tree. And there we go, it matches that other tree a lot better now. But it was nice to block it in with a slightly lighter colour and then go in and darken it up once you're confident with the shape of the tree. There's no reason why you have to get it all done in one go, in one layer. It's okay to go back and darken things up. And I do that quite a lot. I will paint another object next to it which is slightly darker and then realise that I need to go and tweak the values for other elements nearby. And that's why it's important to keep looking over areas that you've already painted to see if you need to adjust them. Because when you paint in a new object or a new element, it may make you realise that the values for other areas nearby is slightly off. I am also going in and darkening up this tree on the left hand side, this really thin tree, as the value for this tree definitely needs to match with the other two, as this tree is also in the foreground. I'm just mixing up a bit more paint, and now I'm going to tackle the largest, thickest tree trunk in this whole reference. This is definitely one that should be sketched out as it is the main tree, and it also has a lot of thin branches coming from it, but I'm not going to paint them in just yet. I'm just going to focus on the shape of the trunk for now. And so it's just a matter of filling in between the lines. I will paint in the start of the branches, but I'm not going to create all of the really thin ones from where the branches keep parting off. I will do that a bit later on when I work on the details for the branches and the foliage. But for now, just block in the shape of the tree trunk. Once again, I'm going to focus on doing this and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. The next tree that I'm going to paint in is a little bit further back than these front trees, so it's going to be noticeably lighter. Therefore, I'm going to make it a lot lighter at the top and then just a bit darker at the bottom. But you can see in the reference there it is quite light for the top half of the tree, and even the bottom half is still a bit lighter than those front trees. So here you can see, look at the bottom of that brushstroke that I just did. You can see that it was creating a textured look because the paint was starting to run out and creating texture with the paper where it just picks up on the top of the paper. So that's what I mean when I say the paint is catching, when I say the paint is too dry and you need to mix in more water to get it to flow better. So if you are finding that the paint is just catching on the top of the paper, on the surface, and not getting in to all of the nooks and crannies, then it means that your paint is too dry and needs a bit more water. Just enough water to make it flow better without compromising on the darkness of the value of the paint. Just darkening up the bottom of that trunk. And once again, you can see that I'm slightly painting over onto the ground, because it really doesn't matter, as we are going to be covering up the ground with a really dark value anyway. So it's okay to blend your paint slightly downwards over onto the ground. I'm going back and darkening up that main tree a bit more, particularly at the bottom. And because we want this to be really dark and look like a silhouette, we don't want any patchiness or streakiness, so you may need to do multiple layers to get that rich, solid colour. Just like if you were painting a wall, it doesn't look great on the first layer, it's patchy, but then as you add a second and third, you get a nice, smooth, rich, flat colour. I'm just darkening up the bottom of this tree and using some clean water to blend out that dark edge into the middle part of the tree. So getting some clean water onto my brush and just blending it upwards. You can also use the tissue to lift up some of that colour, like I've just done, to blend it even more. I hope you guys are enjoying following along with this painting. I found this one very therapeutic to work on. Very relaxing, especially when you don't have to use the wet and wet technique too much. You don't have to stress about the paper drying. Once again, I'm doing the last tree in the front. So this is closest to the right hand side. So we've only got really three or four trees right in the front. So these should be the only darkest ones, and then the others should be slightly lighter. I like to add little bumps even if there aren't really many in the reference. So that's how I like to switch it up a bit, by adding more bumps and curve to the tree trunks. I don't like it if the trees are too straight. I think that's a bit boring. I really do recommend giving these types of paintings a go where you're painting monochromatically, where you're only using one colour, because it is a great exercise to help build your skills as a watercolour artist, because when you only use one colour, you are forced to actually take a lot of notice of your values and really focus on getting your values correct, which is something a lot of beginners artists overlook, whereas values is definitely the most important aspect in making a painting or drawing stand out or look realistic. If you really want your artwork to pop and be eye-catching, then using a range of values is key. And a great way to practice using a range of values and make sure that you're using the whole range of the value scale, not just shadows, but your really light colours and your highlights, is to practice by just using one colour, where your water is the only thing you can use to shift those values. It's a really good challenge and it's really key in growing your skills. And I don't just recommend this for watercolours, but this is a great thing to practice for any medium that you're using, because no matter what medium you are using, you still need to create high contrast in your artwork. I'm just mixing up some more of that really strong concentration of colour to make this tree trunk really dark at the bottom, as well as the one next to it. Just adding a bit of water to get the paint to flow nicely onto the paper. Just like that. And bringing that up to the middle of the tree. And then I'm taking some clean water on my brush and I'm just blending that shadow upwards. And also darkening the top of the tree trunk a little bit as well. We've nearly got in the basis for our trees. We'll just need to go in and add all of the details like the branches and the foliage, which will really bulk and fill out the woods. Detail is another aspect that's going to give your painting a lot of realism and make it really interesting. So just like having a range of values, you also need to have some detail. So we're going to be working on adding lots of detail to the foreground. We're not going to worry so much about adding lots of detail to the trees in the distance. We will add a bit of foliage here and there, but really we're going to focus on adding all of the lovely branches that we got coming off from the big tree towards the middle of the painting. Now you can take this time to look at your painting and see if you want to paint in any more trees, because you can add even more than what is in the reference. Because in the next part we're going to be working on painting in all of the details to the trees, you want to use this time to make sure that you've painted in all of the tree trunks that you want to. Because once we start painting in all of the details in the foreground, it'll be very difficult to then try and go and paint more trees in the background. And also take this time to tweak any of the trees that you think need to be adjusted. So you may need to change things that I'm not changing, and you may not need to do certain things that I'm doing at this stage. So for example, I'm darkening up a lot of the trees that I've already painted in. But if you feel like your trees are already dark enough and you don't need to darken them up anymore, then you can miss out this step. But also there may be trees that I don't need to darken up anymore or adjust, but you may feel like you need to go dark with them. So really try and analyse and self-critique your own painting at this point to see what you want to change before you move on to adding in the branches and foliage and later on the animals. I'm just adding one more tree to the left hand side, making it curve more towards the right. And that tree isn't necessarily in the reference, but I wanted to add in a tree that was leaning more over. And I'm also painting another tree that has a couple of branches coming off of it. So you can add any trees where you feel like there's a bit too much blank space to fill in any large gaps. And then once again, you can let this layer dry before you go in and paint in all of the branches and foliage. I always like to give my painting drying time between layers. Okay, so now that we've painted in all of our trees, it's time to add in the branches and foliage. And this is the really fun part because this is where the woods really starts to come to life. Now I'm mixing a bit more water in with my paint, starting off nice and lightly. We can always go darker if we need to, but a lot of the branches are in the distance as well, so not all of the branches are going to be really dark. Only the branches coming off of the main trees in the foreground are going to be dark. The branches for the trees that are more in the distance will still be light. So start with a really light wash, and I'm using an even thinner paintbrush, as you can see, so that I'm able to get really tiny details. Because the branches are thinner than the tree trunks, you'll want to use a paintbrush that's thinner than the one that you use for the tree trunks. And I'm just going to start to paint in lots of little branches. And you want to do these as thin as possible. But you still want to vary them slightly. So you can do some slightly thicker if they are more of a main branch. And the way branches work is that as they part more and more and separate into more and more branches, those branches will get thinner and thinner. So the branches will get thinner the more they separate off from the main branch. I like to overlap the branches to add depth as well. And I'm not following the reference too closely. I'm looking to see which trees have a lot of branches that we can see. But really, for these branches in the background, you can just sort of have fun with it. And you can see that when I'm painting them in, I do a wavy motion with my hand to give a lot of curve to the branches. I don't just do them straight. And I'm very random with it. You don't need to be too precise. It is really the case of just having fun with it. You can crisscross the branches in all different directions. Just make sure you're doing them really nice and thin. And sometimes my brush doesn't even touch the paper. It skims over the paper at certain areas, which adds these really cool looking breaks in the branches, which I think gives a really nice effect as well. Here you can see a close-up of me working on the left-hand side. And so these branches are going to be barely noticeable. But even though they're not really in your face, this subtlety is what is going to add that distance and that illusion of depth in our painting. So just like you did with the tree trunks, try and keep these details nice and light, because it will have more of an impact in the final result of the painting than you may think. Most of the branches are throughout the top part of the painting. So that's where I'm going to focus my attention the most and really crisscross and overlap these branches to give a real fullness to this area and to make these branches look really dense and like they're all tangled within each other. So I'm starting off with the light ones in the background, and then I'll add lots of darker ones over the top that are more in the foreground. And just like the tree trunks, the branches that are more in the distance are going to be thinner, and then the branches for these main trees in the foreground will be thicker branches. So I'm almost doing like really long S shapes. And so I like to paint in the main branch, and then I do little ones coming off it here and there. So the next thing we need to do is use our sponge to add some foliage. dipping the sponge into our wash that we've just used to paint in those branches. I use an old part of a washing up sponge, just a cheap washing up sponge. I just ripped a segment of it off. That's all you need. You don't need anything fancy. And I dip the rougher edge, not the smooth edge, the edge that I ripped. I dab that into the paint and I just tap it onto areas where I want a natural look of foliage. And it gives a really natural result because there's a lot of randomness to the speckled bits of paint that get transferred onto the paper. If you were to paint it with a paintbrush, you're likely to do them all uniformed as you get into a rhythm, and all of the little leaves will start to look the same. Whereas when you use a sponge, it naturally adds a lot of randomness, which gives you that realistic effect. And you can see that the texture that we've created with our sponge really closely resembles the look of the foliage that we can see in the reference. Just using this simple trick. And you can use this technique to help fill in any gaps that you think look a bit boring. You don't have to follow the reference exactly with this stage either. You can add foliage to areas that aren't in the reference. And so I'm just going to go throughout this whole painting and just tap my sponge lightly into areas that I want to create the foliage. Mixing up some more of that paint, still adding a lot of water. And you don't want your sponge to be absolutely drenched and saturated with the paint. You just want a bit of the paint on the tip of the sponge so that you can really control where it goes. And if you have less paint on your sponge, you're able to get more individual looking speckles, whereas if the sponge is absolutely saturated with paint, it just all comes off as like one clump, kind of like how it did just there. And so if you find that your sponge has got too much paint on it and it's not really creating these individual speckles, then go in and squeeze off some of that paint and go back in and try again, or test it on some scrap paper before you go in and actually use this technique on your artwork, if you're not used to using this technique. It'll only take you 5 minutes just to practice on a bit of paper and get a feel for how much water you need in your paint, how much paint you need on the sponge, and it will just save you a lot of hassle than if you go in and you mess up your whole painting, especially at this stage, because your woods could be looking really nice and you could be really happy with that distance that you've created. And then adding in this foliage, you don't want it to break your piece and ruin it. So it's worth just giving it a little practice. Now I'm going to go in and add a bit more paint to the wash of colour so that it's a bit darker, and I'm going to add some darker foliage now to the painting. So all you need to do is to make the paint a bit more concentrated, is just to mix a bit more paint into that previous wash. And I'm just tapping the sponge on any areas where there's foliage in the foreground. You can use the tissue to blot up any paint if it's a bit dark in certain areas. But I'm not going to add too much dark foliage for this painting because there's not really too much in the reference image. Most of the details in the foreground are branches. But there is a bit of darker foliage towards the bottom of the woods, near the ground between the deer and the boar. I'm adding a bit of foliage to the left corner of the painting. And here you can see some close-ups of what it looks like when you tap the sponge down onto the paper. You can see that you get a variety of tiny speckles and some larger ones. This is the fastest way to create this really cool texture. And with the dark paint, because there's less water mixed in, you're going to get even crisper, tiny details. So I'm adding some darker foliage, like I said, towards the bottom of the woods, in between the deer and the boar. You don't want to go overboard with this. You still want to leave some gaps around so that you can see the faint tree trunks peeking through. So you don't want to completely saturate the whole of the painting with loads of foliage. That would really ruin the illusion of the trees in the distance if you just cover everything up. So really plan where you want to add this foliage and make sure you're happy with the placement before you go in with the sponge. Just adding a bit more darker foliage to the upper left hand corner, and then we're going to move on and start working on the branches in the foreground. Now that we're painting the branches for the main trees, we are going to want the branches to match the value of the tree itself. As you can see, the tree is very dark, so you want to make sure that the paint you're using to paint in these branches is also very dark and thick. So for this step, mainly just use concentrated paint with a bit of water mixed in to help the paint flow better. Now with these main branches, they are going to be thickest where they meet the tree trunk, and then they are going to get thinner and thinner, especially if they branch off a lot. So you can see that I thicken up the branch where it's meeting with the tree trunk, and the end of this branch that I've just painted in is very thin. I'm now going to paint in a branch that's slightly above the other one. It crisscrosses over it just at the end, and I'm doing very jagged motions with the brush to make it look really interesting. If you look at the reference, the branches are actually very jagged. None of these branches are straight. They're very bumpy and curvy. So I try to stutter a lot with my hand to create some natural looking shape to the branches. So I try and make my hand almost shake and tremble to create this effect. And it works really well at creating a really mystical, magical look to the trees. Just thickening up that branch. And I'm just going to carry on overlapping these branches. Starting off with these main ones, I'm first blocking in all of the main ones, coming off from where we started painting the branches on the main tree. So before, when we painted in that main tree, we kind of painted in the start of these branches. So I'm just filling in all of those first, connecting them to the start of the branch that we've added in. And then I'll go through and add lots of the individual branches that are behind these main ones and separate these branches into more parts as well. Already this painting is looking so much more interesting just by adding those couple of branches. And I recommend painting these straight on with really dark, thick paint. With the tree trunks, I said you could add a base wash and then darken them up once you're happy with them. But with the branches, when you're painting them this thin, you don't really want to have to try and then paint over them with a second layer, because chances are they'll become thicker because you can't paint it exactly at the same point for these thin branches, and therefore they'll look too bulky. So it's best to just paint in these branches straight away with really dark paint. Plus, you don't have to be too perfect over them, so you can't really mess up this stage. You can't really add a bad looking branch because they are so random and so unique. Some are thicker, some are thinner, some are straighter, some are more jagged, and they go in different directions. Some are curving downwards like the ones I'm painting now, and some go off to the side. So don't worry too much about messing up the branches. It's okay just to go in and paint them with some really dark paint. Now that I've pretty much got in all of those main branches, you can see that I'm starting to work on adding the really thin details that are coming off from each branch. So I'm extending some of these branches further down to sweep down just above the deer. And I probably won't add as many branches as you can see in the reference. I'll just get the basic gist of them down. So you'll want to use as thin of a brush as you have and paint in loads of little overlapping really thin branches behind these main branches, and also separate these main branches off into lots of little parts. You can also have some branches coming down from the edges and corners of the paper, as if they're coming from another tree or part of the tree that we can't see in the painting, like I'm doing here. And you can paint on more larger bits of foliage that you can see with more clarity with your paintbrush. You can paint them in with your brush rather than the sponge if you want. And you can see I'm just going in and basically doodling with my brush, just sort of scribbling to add these really thin branches. They're almost like painting in individual hairs because they're so thin. Once again, just like the foliage, you don't want to go overboard with the branches either. You still want to leave portions of the wood showing through in between the branches. So don't go overboard, or don't feel like you have to add a ton of branches all over the place. I'm adding some of these main branches that are sweeping down towards the ball. So I am trying to paint in all of the main branches that I can see in the reference, the thickest ones. And you can even add some more main branches if you want that aren't in the reference. If you feel like it will look really cool to have a thick branch coming in from the left-hand side, sweeping in the foreground, then go ahead. Really be creative. And take your time with this part. Don't rush through adding in these branches because it can be time consuming and you may even find it a bit tedious. But it's really going to finish off the woods and really take it to that next level. Plus, we're nearly finished with this painting anyway. Once we've done this, we just have to do the animals and the ground. And with that step, it's just pretty much filling in your sketch outline with dark paint. So don't rush, have fun with it, enjoy the process. Here you can see a close-up of how I'm painting in those branches. Just using the very tip of my brush, barely even touching the brush to the paper. You kind of almost want to not touch the paper so that it skims in some areas and so you're able to get that thickest line. Plus, if you paint a branch that you don't like I just did, then if you're very quick, you can use some tissue to lift it straight back up. And then it won't show through as much and it'll be more subtle. So you can always use tissue to basically erase mistakes as long as you act fast and blot it up whilst the paint is still wet. So you can see as it separates more and more, the branches get thinner and thinner. And once again, I'm letting my hand sort of shake. I'm making my hand shake as I do this to get that really jagged look. And I'm not thinking too much about it. I'm not overthinking it. I just go with the flow. And if I make a little mistake, I just make it into a new branch. Just thickening up some of the main parts of the branch. And I'm going to add a few more branches around the top left hand side. I want to add some more around that upper left hand corner as it's looking a bit sparse. And as you can see in the reference, there's a lot of branches in this area. Also, make sure that you pay attention to the tree that the branches are connecting to. You don't want to accidentally connect the branch to the wrong tree. So before you go in and paint the branch, make sure you know what part of the tree it's connecting to. Now I'm going to spend another minute or so just adding in the final little branches, and then I'll come back to talk you through the next step. Now that we've painted in all of the branches, we're going to finish off the woods by adding a couple more bits of darker foliage. So I've just dipped my sponge into that darkest paint that I've mixed up, the darkest value of paint, and I'm just tapping this over the top of some of those darker branches just to sort of top those main branches with some leaves. And I'm going to focus a lot of this on the left hand side. But once again, you really don't want to go overboard with this, especially as this is really dark paint. So be quite minimal with your approach to this step. And then once you've done this, you can wait for that layer to completely dry, and then we can move on to painting in the animals. Now it's time to paint in the animals. Once again, because these animals are right in the front of the image, we want to paint them as dark as we can, especially because if you look at the reference, you can see that these animals, like the trees in front, are pretty much black. So you want to mix up the most intense dark value that you can get with your paint, making sure that it matches with those trees right in the front, and use this to fill in your sketch outline for the silhouette of the deer and the boar and the ground. Now I'm going to use a couple of different size brushes for this, while I recommend to use a few different size brushes. I'm using my teeny tiny brush that you can see here in order to paint in the really detailed parts of the deer and get a really accurate outline of the deer. So you can see that I'm using it first to paint in the antlers, and it should be fairly easy to do this step because you should already have the animals sketched out. And that's why it's really important to spend a lot of time getting a really accurate sketch before you start painting, because it will make the job of painting a lot easier, which you definitely want, especially when you're using a really dark black paint where you can't afford to make mistakes. So if anything, I really recommend that with the main trees and the animals, any parts that you are going to paint really dark, I recommend that these are areas that you definitely include in your sketch outline. And as you can see in my sketch outline that I've included, these are areas that I've focused on sketching in. And at this point, it's really just a case of filling in these areas. And whenever you do any other silhouette paintings as well, I would do them with the same approach of making sure that you sketch out any parts that are going to be really dark and the silhouettes, and then fill them in. And I recommend using this really tiny brush around the outer edge of the deer so that the shape of the deer is really accurate and crisp. And then you can use a larger brush to fill in the middle of the deer and the body of the deer, but you'll want to use a smaller brush to outline the deer. And as you can see, because we are using a really dark colour, it's just going to cover up any little bits of trees that overlapped with the deer that we painted in earlier. It just covers up any of that paint, and same with the ground. The ground will cover up any messy bits at the bottom of the trees that we've got, and it will all come together. So now that we've finished the woods, you can really see how using a variety of values with our trees has really created a realistic illusion of distance through our forest. You can tell that there's trees really close to us that are bigger, and that we've got some really faint ones in the background. It really has that 3D look. I'm also painting in now the slightly bigger antler at the back. Once again, being very careful. This is a part that you really don't want to rush, because the deer and the animals are going to be one of the main focal points that people will look at with your painting. And unlike branches and trees and leaves where you can get away with them being a bit imperfect because they are more random, with the animals, you want to make sure that it does look as close to perfect as you can. Otherwise it will look weird. So you don't want any jagged edges on the antlers. And you want the body to be the right shape. You don't want to stray too far from your sketch outline. Whereas with the branches, it didn't really matter if you messed up at all, because it didn't need to be perfect. There wasn't any such thing as a perfect looking branch or the right looking branch. If you don't feel confident using a paintbrush for this step, then you could always use like a black ink pen, like a fine liner, but it may have a different finish to the watercolors. And so it may look slightly strange. And it is very important that you do mix in a little bit of water with your paint so that you are able to get really fluid brush strokes, because you definitely want a clean edge to the edge of your animal. When you're doing a silhouette, your edges are so important and you want them to be nice and clean. You don't want the paint to be dry and to skim over certain areas of the paper. Once again, I'm just filling in the body, and you can use a larger brush to fill in the body if you want to make it faster. And with the deer, you don't have to get it done in one layer. Just like with those main trees, you can block it in with this dark paint, and then if any areas look patchy or a bit lighter, then you can go over them with a second layer. Because naturally you may get a more patchy look where certain areas have had a bit more water mixed in with the paint. So a second layer will definitely give you that lovely flat wash that you want. And don't worry if in certain areas, like where the body now meets the tree, you can't really see the edge of the deer and where the tree starts. Because these are the same value, they are just going to merge in and look the same. And that's okay. Just outlining the shape of the back of the deer's body and the legs, and just filling in the legs now with some paint. I find that this is the easiest way to approach these silhouettes, is to outline very carefully and then fill it in. So I'm just going to continue to paint the deer in this way until it's finished, and then I will talk you through the next step. Also, if you look at the reference, you can see that the deer's feet, you can't really see them. The legs meet with the ground, and because the ground is the same value as the deer, they're both the silhouette, you can't necessarily see the bottom of the deer's feet. So don't feel like you have to try and paint these in your painting. Because we can't see them, just simply don't include them. Don't feel like you have to include certain things if they're not visible in the reference image. Also, if you've added too much watercolour over your silhouettes and you can no longer see the sketch outlines, then pause, wait for what you've done to dry, and then you can always go back in with your graphite pencil and re-sketch out the deer silhouette before you fill it in with the black, so that you've got an accurate sketch. Don't try and wing it, and don't try and guess where the edges of your lines are and where the legs are and the body is, or the antlers. If you can't see your sketch outline, just wait for the painting to dry if it's still wet and just re-sketch it out, because it's going to be really hard to try and guess where the lines are, and just to sort of freehand it with the black paint. That's most likely going to cause mistakes, and you can't easily fix that. And you don't want to ruin all of the hard work you've done with the rest of the painting by trying to rush it. So go back in, re-sketch it out. That way you can erase those graphite lines as much as you want until you're happy with it. And once again, now I'm painting in the boar. This step is a bit boring, pardon the pun, because you're just simply outlining your sketch and filling it in. There's not really much else to it than that. You've just got to be really patient and really try and have a lot of control over your paintbrush. So make sure that this stage has got your complete 100% attention, because you don't want to fall at the final hurdle and make a mistake here. You can see how beautiful that deer looks in that woodland scenery. The deer makes it look even more magical. And this painting reminds me of Patronus. It gives me Harry Potter vibes. Don't know if that's just me. So I'm just filling in the body of the boar now that I've outlined it. And once again, the legs of the boar merge in with the ground as well. So the legs are going to extend into the ground. So once again, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes finishing off the boar, and then we'll move on to the ground. Now for the ground, you'll want to use the exact same paint that you used for the deer and the boar, the same value. You will want them to match, especially because the legs of the deer and boar are meeting with the ground, so that it needs to all be the same value. So if you have to remix up the paint, make sure you're using the same amount of water. And what I'm doing is I'm going in with a larger brush this time. It's important to use a larger paintbrush and not that really tiny one that we use for the deer and the boar, because you'd be there forever painting this ground. Like I said earlier, it's important to use the appropriate sized brush for each area in order to do it most efficiently and get the best result. So I'm using a much larger brush. And once again, I have got the ground marked out in my sketch outline. I have marked out a line for the ground. So I'm simply just filling in that whole area, and you will be covering up the messy bottoms of the tree trunks, and so it will all start to look a lot more cohesive and finished off. It's okay if the paint has a bit more water mixed in, because you can always build this up in multiple layers until you get everything matching and the same value. As you can see, I'm adding more paint to slowly darken it up, because with the ground, because we are filling in a larger area with this colour, you are probably going to get a lot more patchiness, so you will need to go over this in multiple layers. Because as you can see, the ground is a lot lighter than the deer. It definitely doesn't look like a silhouette yet. One thing that you can see that I'm doing now is I'm using a pretty clean paintbrush. So I'm cleaning off my brush and I'm pulling some of that colour from the deer and from the ground upwards, because I want to darken up slightly the area above the ground, because I feel like those gaps are a bit white and I want to darken it up. So I'm just pulling some more of that colour through the bottom portion of the woods. Make sure you don't ruin your deer silhouette by blending the paint too much. See, that matches the reference a lot better. I'm adding another layer over the top of the ground. Now once I've done this, the ground is going to match with the animals and the trees a lot better. And once again, you can see that apart from the background, everything else we've painted using the wet on dry method, which means that you really don't have to rush this piece. You can take it as slow as you want. The background is the only part of this whole painting that was a bit time sensitive. But even then, we didn't have to do too much with the background, so it's not too stressful. So this should be a really relaxing, fun project to give a go. It will help you learn about the values through doing a monochromatic painting. And it's such a beautiful reference to paint. Let me know in the comment section what you learnt about this painting, like what skills you feel like you've learnt through this tutorial. Is there any new techniques that you tried that you haven't before, like the sponge technique? Have you learnt how to create the illusion of distance a bit more easily? Let me know your thoughts on the tutorial and what you learnt, what you enjoyed the most, and what you feel like you need to work a bit more on, or what you'd like to see more tutorials on. Now this painting is pretty much finished. We are just going to make some final adjustments. One main one being adding a bit of grass detail to the ground, so it doesn't just look like a line. We'll want to start to add in a few blades of grass. So that's what I'm going to start to do. You don't need to add grass for every single part of the ground, but adding a few blades here and there will just make it look a lot more realistic. When you do paint in these individual bits of grass, make sure that you are, once again, using a smaller paintbrush so that you can get in these details. You'll want to use the same brush that you used to paint in the thinnest branches. I'm also painting in individual bits of fur on the deer. At the moment, the silhouette is looking very smooth, and just adding a few bits of fur is going to make it look more realistic and more interesting, because the deer isn't just going to be smooth, it's going to have little tufts of fur sticking out. So I'm replicating that in my painting to make it look more natural and realistic. Same with the boar, just adding a bit of detail. And now I'm painting in those couple blades of grass. Do these with the really dark, thick paint so that they match with the ground. You don't want these blades of grass to be lighter than the ground, because that will look strange and will detract from the silhouette illusion. Now what you can do is wait for the whole painting to completely dry and then see if you need to touch up any areas with more dark paint in order to make everything look a smooth wash of colour and not look patchy. But I'm just finishing off this painting with a couple of splatters just to create a more expressive look for the painting. So I'm just tapping on the back of that paintbrush, and once it's dry, I'm removing the tape to reveal a nice border. And here you can see the final result from this tutorial. I really hope you guys enjoyed following along with this and like the result that you got. Thank you so much for following along with this tutorial. I really hope it helped you, and I will see you in the next one. Bye everyone.